Tudor era's biggest lies. You still believe. Let me ask you something. Close your eyes. Picture Anne Boleyn. What do you see? Black hair, dark eyes, maybe a slight exotic figure with a hint of something dangerous. Now, picture Henry VIII in his later years. A waddling mountain of meat, throwing chicken bones over his shoulder, roaring at servants. You see those images instantly, don't you? I'm about to ruin that for you. The Tudor era, roughly 1485 to 1603, has been turned into a reality show. A very expensive, beheading-filled reality show. And over the last 500 years, we've layered so much fiction on top of these people that the real history has suffocated. Not just tiny details. I'm talking about the biggest, juiciest, most famous facts about this dynasty. They're lies, not misunderstandings. Lies. Some were invented by their enemies. Some were invented by the Tudors themselves as propaganda. And some were invented by Victorian novelists and Hollywood screenwriters who thought the truth was just too boring. Today, we're going to dismantle the entire Tudor myth machine. We're going to look at the 6 biggest lies you still believe about this family. And by the end, you might realize that the real Tudors are far stranger, far more human, and far more terrifying than the cartoons we've made them into. Let's start with the biggest one. The one that makes history buffs scream into their pillows. Anne Boleyn was a sexy, exotic homewrecker. Look, I get it. The casting directors have a type. For the last 100 years, whenever they need to cast Anne Boleyn, they find the most sultry, dark-haired, doe-eyed actress they can. Genevieve Bujold, Natalie Dormer. She's always slinking around corners, speaking French, being the other woman. Here's the truth that will break your brain. Anne Boleyn was not considered a great beauty in her own time. I'll say it again. She was not the knockout. Her sister Mary was the famous beauty. In fact, when the Venetian diplomat wrote home about Anne, he didn't mention her face. He mentioned her style, her fashion, her black eyes. But he also noted a defect, a 6th fingernail on one hand. Now, historians argue whether that was just a rumor spread by her enemies. But the point stands. Her appeal was not her face. What was it then? Magnetism. She was witty. She was sharp-tongued in an era where women were supposed to be quiet. She had spent time in the French court, where she learned how to flirt intellectually, not just physically. She debated religion with men. She argued with Henry. And for a king who was bored out of his skull by his pious, gentle wife, Catherine of Aragon, that was rocket fuel. The home wrecker label is even more dishonest. Did she cause the divorce? No. Henry VIII had already decided he needed a male heir. He had already fallen out of love with Catherine years before Anne came along. In fact, Henry had already tried to seduce Anne's sister Mary and gotten bored. Anne was Plan B, but when she refused to become his mistress, a radical move, she changed the game. She said, "I am yours only if you make me queen." But here's the lie within the lie. The idea that Anne schemed her way onto the throne. The idea that she whispered poison into Henry's ear to get rid of Thomas Wolsey and Cardinal Campeggio. That was written by a man named George Cavendish. He was Cardinal Wolsey's servant. He watched his master fall, and he blamed a woman. It's the oldest story in the book. The wicked witch made the good king do it. The truth is, Anne was a political reformer. She was an evangelical. She gave Henry books like Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man, which argued that kings should rule the church, not the Pope. Without Anne Boleyn, there is no Church of England. She wasn't just a sex object. She was an intellectual partner. And that's why they killed her. Not because she was a witch. Not because she slept with her brother. Because she miscarried a son, and Henry needed a scapegoat for his own disappointment. And that brings us to our next lie. You think you know why Henry went from defender of the faith to serial husband. You don't. Henry VIII was always a fat, lustful monster. Pop quiz. When you hear Henry VIII, what age do you see? I know. You see the Holbein painting, the wide stance, the embroidered coat, the beard, the suspiciously small legs holding up a planet-sized torso. He looks like a man who ate a peasant for breakfast. But Henry VIII reigned for 38 years, and for the first half of that, he was a rock star. In 1515, Henry was 6'2" tall. In an era when the average man was 5'7", he was muscular, not fat, not chubby, ripped. He jousted in full armor. He could hunt for 10 hours straight. He composed music and listened to pastime with good company, he wrote that. He was fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. He was the most educated king in Europe. The fat Henry, you imagine. That didn't happen until his mid-40s. Why? 2 reasons. First, a jousting accident in 1536. He fell from his horse, and the horse landed on him. He was unconscious for 2 hours. The leg injury never healed properly. It ulcerated. It stank. He couldn't exercise anymore. Second, his lifestyle caught up with him. He was eating massive feasts every day, up to 5,000 calories in a sitting, but no longer burning it off. The psychology of the monster is also a lie. Historians love to say he was a narcissist. Sure, but look at the trauma. By 1536, he had been excommunicated by the Pope. His best friend, Thomas More, had refused to support him and was executed. His daughter Mary was declared a bastard. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a 40,000-man rebellion, marched on London. And then his beloved Jane Seymour died, giving him the son he waited 27 years for. Henry didn't become a monster overnight. He became a terrified, isolated, obese, paranoid man. But we remember him as a cartoon villain because it's easier. Because we don't want to pity a man who killed 2 of his wives, but you should pity him because pity is harder to dismiss than hate. Now, let's talk about his most famous victim. The name that makes people shudder. Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary was a fanatical, incompetent butcher. I need you to forget everything you know about Mary Fye. Forget the phrase Bloody Mary. Forget the image of her sitting on a throne, lighting faggots under Protestants while cackling. That image was created by her enemies, specifically by a man named John Foxe. John Foxe wrote The Book of Martyrs. It was the best-selling book in England after the Bible for 200 years, and it was propaganda. Foxe worked for Elizabeth I. Elizabeth needed to legitimize her own reign by demonizing her predecessor. So, Foxe took the 283 executions that happened during Mary's 5-year reign and burned them into the English psyche. Here's the context they don't tell you. Mary's father, Henry, had torn England away from Rome. Her brother, Edward VI, had turned England into a radical Protestant state, smashing stained glass, melting gold altars, banning the Latin Mass. Mary grew up hearing that she was a bastard, that her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was a whore, that the religion she loved was devil worship. When she became queen in 1553, she had 2 choices: forgive everyone or restore order. She chose order. and by the standards of the 16th century, 283 executions over 5 years was not exceptional. Her father executed 72,000 people for theft, for vagrancy, for treason. Her half-sister Elizabeth executed hundreds of Catholic priests, including many who were just saying Mass in secret. But we don't call Elizabeth Bloody Bess. Why? Because Mary lost. She died childless. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years and controlled the history books. History is written by the victors. Mary wasn't a sadist. She was a desperate woman who watched her world burn and tried to put out the fire with the only tool she had, the law. She didn't burn people for fun. She burned heretics who refused to convert. It was legal, it was common, it was wrong, but it was not insanity. And here's the deepest cut. The nickname Bloody Mary wasn't even used widely until the 17th century. And it wasn't invented by Protestants. It was invented by a political faction trying to stop James II from becoming Catholic. They resurrected Mary's ghost as a warning. Look what happens when a Catholic takes the throne. That's it. A political smear campaign that lasted 400 years. But the lies about women don't stop with Mary. They get far, far worse when we turn to the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth I was a chaste, flawless goddess. Okay, I love Elizabeth I. She's my favorite Tudor. She survived more betrayals than a spy novel protagonist. But the image of her as Gloriana, the untouchable, perfect, virgin goddess in a white dress, is the most successful rebranding campaign in history, and it was entirely fake, designed by her for her survival. Here's the truth. Elizabeth was sexual. She was flirtatious. She had favorites. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was almost certainly her lover. Not sleeping with him? That's a technicality. They were emotionally inseparable. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died falling down the stairs in 1560, everyone suspected murder. Elizabeth had to back away from Dudley to save her reputation. But the letters they wrote to each other, their love letters, pure, aching, passionate love letters. The Virgin Queen myth was a political strategy. Here's the math. If Elizabeth married a foreign prince, England would become a puppet state. If she married an English nobleman, civil war would break out because the other nobles would be jealous. If she had a child, that child would become a target for assassination. So she invented a third option, marriage to England itself. She wore rings symbolizing her marriage to the realm. She used the imagery of the Virgin Mary, but a Protestant, to position herself as a spiritual mother to the nation. It was genius, but it was a lie. In private, she raged against it. She once told a Scottish ambassador, "I desire no higher title than to be your queen, but I will not be a nun." We also sanitize her personality. Elizabeth was not sweet. She was vicious. She swore like a sailor. She would beat her ladies-in-waiting when she was angry. She once threw a shoe at a courtier. She had her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, executed after 19 years of house arrest. She watched the Spanish Armada burn and laughed. But we don't remember the rage. We remember the portraits, the pale skin, the pearl necklace, the fan. Why? Because Elizabeth controlled her image like a modern Instagram influencer. She passed laws forbidding any unflattering portraits. If a painter made her look old or ugly, they went to prison. The mask of youth. That white makeup wasn't vanity. It was a political tool. She was saying, "I am eternal. I am not aging. You cannot replace me." But she did age. By the end, she was bald, missing teeth, and covered in smallpox scars. She refused to look in mirrors. The last years of her reign were a disaster: famine, war, corruption. But we still say Gloriana because the myth is prettier than the lonely, dying woman who outlived everyone she loved. Now, let's get out of the palace. Let's talk about the lie you've seen in every movie, the one about peasants. Everyone smelled terrible, and life was a grim brown hell. You know the shot. The camera pans down a muddy London street. A man throws a bucket of feces out a window. Rats scurry. People are hunched, gray, dying of plague. The entire Tudor period looks like it was filmed through a dirty lens filter. Stop. Just stop. The Tudors were obsessed with cleanliness. Obsessed. Henry VIII had a groom of the stool. Yes, that's a real job whose entire purpose was to manage the king's toilet. But here's the kicker. The groom of the stool was one of the most powerful positions in court. He controlled access to the king. He became a millionaire. Because cleanliness was status. People bathed. Not every day, because hauling hot water was labor-intensive. But the wealthy bathed weekly in wooden tubs lined with linen. They used scented soaps made from animal fat and lavender. They scrubbed their teeth with soot and sage. They washed their hands before meals. The idea that they didn't know germs existed? They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that washing prevented illness. They weren't stupid. The throwing feces out the window thing. Illegal. There were laws. You could be fined or put in the stocks. London had rakers, garbage collectors. And while it wasn't clean by our standards, it was far cleaner than Victorian London. The Industrial Revolution was the real filth disaster. Tudor London had gardens. It had fresh water conduits. It had public latrines on London Bridge that flushed into the river. The color palette is another lie. We colorize the Tudor era in browns and grays. Go look at a Tudor building today. It's white. White with black wooden beams. They whitewashed everything. They painted their walls bright colors: red, yellow, blue. They hung tapestries that looked like comic books. They wore clothes dyed with madder red, woad blue, and weld yellow. The grim dark aesthetic was invented by Victorian historians who believed the Middle Ages and Renaissance were primitive. They projected their own industrial grime backwards, and movies love it because gray is cheaper than color. Even the food. You think they ate bland boiled mush? Tudor kitchens used cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, sugar, cloves. They had access to spices from around the world. A Tudor feast was a riot of flavor, color, and texture. They ate swan, peacock, porpoise. They made sugar sculptures of castles. The idea that they had terrible taste? No. Their taste was just different. They loved sweet and sour combinations. They loved food that looked like something else, a pie shaped like a ship. We infantilize the past. We assume they were dirty, stupid, and miserable because it makes us feel superior. They weren't. They were just us, without electricity. And that brings me to the final, most dangerous lie, the one that distorts everything else. The Tudors were unique, a special, terrible, glorious family. This is a lie that hurts me the most, because we love the Tudors. We obsess over them. Podcasts, novels, TV shows, tours. But in doing so, we isolate them. We pretend they were a freak accident of history. 6 freaks who ruled England through sheer force of personality. They weren't. The Tudors were not unique. They were symptoms. They were the product of a Europe-wide crisis. Every country in the 1500s had a version of Henry VIII. France had Francis I. Spain had Charles V. The Holy Roman Empire had the same religious wars, the same beheadings, the same betrayals. The only difference is that England had a weak monarchy before the Tudors. The War of the Roses, 30 years of civil war, left the nobility decimated. The Tudors stepped into a power vacuum. They didn't create the machinery of terror, they inherited it. Henry VII invented the Court of Star Chamber to crush rebellious nobles. Henry VIII just used it. Even the Tudor personality, the paranoia, the grandeur, the violence was normal. Charles V abdicated because he was exhausted by the impossibility of ruling. Philip II of Spain sat in a cold monastery of a palace and micromanaged his empire into bankruptcy. The 16th century was the century of the breakdown of the old order, the Reformation, the discovery of the New World, the printing press, the gunpowder revolution. The Tudors didn't cause this chaos. They survived it, barely. And here's the truth they don't teach you in the documentaries. The Tudor dynasty ended because of an illness, not a murder, not a betrayal. Elizabeth died of old age, and she refused to name a successor. When she died, the crown went to the Stuarts, the family she had executed, and nothing changed. James I was just as paranoid. He just preferred men to women. We tell the story of the Tudors as a morality play. 6 characters, 6 endings. But the real lesson is this: power does not corrupt. Power reveals. Henry VIII was always insecure. Anne Boleyn was always brilliant. Mary was always wounded. Elizabeth was always alone. The throne didn't change them. It just made their secrets public. So where does that leave us? Do we stop watching the Tudors? Do we burn our Philippa Gregory novels? No. Fiction is fine. Fiction is fun. But when fiction becomes fact in your brain, you lose the ability to understand the present. Every time you call a female leader cold or hysterical, you are repeating the Anne Boleyn lie. Every time you dismiss a political opponent as a monster, you are repeating the Henry VIII lie. Every time you reduce a complex historical figure to a single nickname, Bloody Mary, you're choosing propaganda over truth. The Tudors were not gods. They were not demons. They were people trapped in a system that demanded perfection and punished any failure with death. And the real horror of the Tudor era isn't the executions, it's the loneliness. Imagine being Henry, knowing that every person who smiles at you wants your power. Imagine being Elizabeth, knowing that the only man you ever loved might have murdered his wife. Imagine being Mary, knowing that your own father declared you a bastard, and your own people will remember you as a butcher. That is the truth. Not glamorous, not simple, just human. And that is far more interesting than any lie Hollywood can sell you. Welcome back. I hope you've had time to recover, because we only scratched the surface. We dismantled the big ones. Anne Boleyn, the homewrecker. Henry, the cartoon monster. Bloody Mary, the fanatic. Elizabeth, the frozen virgin. The filthy Tudor lie. And the idea that this family was somehow unique. But the Tudor lie factory has more assembly lines. Many more. You see, once you start pulling at one thread, the whole tapestry unravels. And people get upset. They write angry letters. They say, "But I saw it in a documentary." Or worse, "I read it in a historical novel." Historical novels are not history. They are stories wearing history's clothes. Today, we are going to commit historical blasphemy. We are going to question the sacred cows. We are going to look at the lies you still believe about. The Princes in the Tower, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish Armada, Tudor sex, Tudor food, Tudor medicine, and the biggest lie of all, that we have finally gotten the story right. Fasten your mental seatbelt. Richard III murdered the princes in the Tower, and the Tudors were the heroes who avenged them. This one is radioactive, because it touches the very foundation of the Tudor claim to the throne. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, won the crown by killing Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485. But he needed a justification. He couldn't just say, "I had a bigger army." He had to say, "I am saving England from a tyrant who murdered his own nephews." The story goes like this. In 1483, Edward IV died. His two sons, Edward V, age 12, and Richard of Shrewsbury, age 9, were placed in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard III. Then they vanished, presumed dead. Richard III was blamed. Thomas More wrote a lurid account of the murders. Shakespeare turned it into a masterpiece of evil. Here's what they don't tell you. First, Thomas More wrote his History of King Richard III in 1513, 30 years after the princes disappeared. More was a child when it happened. He was writing for the Tudor court. He was writing for the family that had every reason to smear Richard. And he never claimed to have evidence. He wrote, "I shall rehearse what I have heard. Hearsay, gossip, 30-year-old gossip." Second, no bodies were found at the time. In 1674, workmen digging in the tower found a box containing 2 small skeletons. Charles II had them reburied in Westminster Abbey as the princes, but no forensic examination was done then. In 1933, they were briefly examined, and the ages roughly matched. But the examination was not conclusive. And in 2012, the Church of England refused permission for DNA testing. We still do not know if those are the princes. Third, there were other suspects. Margaret Beaufort Henry VII's own mother had a motive. She was desperate to put her son on the throne. She had access to the Tower. She was a cold, calculating political operator. Some historians argue she arranged the murders to clear the way for Bosworth, but the Tudor narrative couldn't blame her. So they blamed the dead king. And here's the lie within the lie. The Tudor claim to the throne was shaky. Henry VII's mother was a descendant of John of Gaunt, but through an illegitimate line. His father was a nobody. He had no real right to the crown except conquest. So he needed Richard to be a monster. He needed the princes to be martyrs. He needed the story to be simple. But history is never simple. Richard III, by the laws of the time, may have believed the princes were illegitimate. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was controversial. Some documents suggest a pre-contract with another woman. If that were true, the princes were bastards, and Richard was the rightful king. We don't know. The documents were conveniently destroyed. What we do know is that the Princes in the Tower story became the cornerstone of Tudor propaganda. Every schoolchild for 500 years learned that Richard was a hunchbacked villain who killed little boys. That image came from Shakespeare, who was paid by the Tudors. It's not history. It's a hit job. The real Richard III, based on his skeleton found under a parking lot in 2012, had scoliosis, not a withered arm. He was not a monster. He was a competent administrator who passed progressive laws, including bail reform. But we don't remember that. We remember the lie. Thomas Cromwell was a cold, calculating, heartless bureaucrat. If you've seen Wolf Hall, either the book or the TV series, you have a more sympathetic view of Thomas Cromwell than most. But for the average person, Cromwell is the villain of the Tudor story, the enforcer, the man who destroyed the monasteries, engineered Anne Boleyn's death, and sent Thomas More to the block. He's played with a sneer and a German accent. Let me tell you about the real Thomas Cromwell. He was born in Putney, the son of a blacksmith and a brewer. He was a ruffian. As a young man, he fled England after a fight, joined the French army, then became a merchant in Italy. He taught himself law. He taught himself banking. He spoke several languages fluently. He rose from absolutely nothing to become the second most powerful man in England. That is a remarkable story. But we ignore it because he was the bad guy. Here's what he actually did. He invented modern government. Before Cromwell, England was run like a medieval garage sale. The king's household managed everything. Cromwell created departments. He introduced parish registers the first time births, marriages, and deaths were recorded. He reformed taxation so the poor weren't crushed. He commissioned the first English translation of the Bible to be placed in every church. He believed that ordinary people should be able to read the Word of God in their own language. The monastery thing? Yes, he closed them down. But here's the context no one gives you. By the 1530s, most monasteries in England were not holy places. They were country clubs for the wealthy. The monks were often absent, corrupt, or living in luxury. The money that flowed into monasteries from land, from tithes, went to Rome. Cromwell redirected that money to fund the new Church of England, to build schools, and to fortify the coast against invasion. He was not greedy, he was pragmatic. Did he personally want Anne Boleyn dead? Unlikely. He was her ally. They were both reformers. But when Henry VIII turned against her, Cromwell had a choice: help Anne and die with her, or orchestrate the trial and survive. He chose survival. He even tried to save her by getting her to confess to a lesser crime. She refused. He wept afterward. We have a letter he wrote to a friend that night. "I have lost the best friend I ever had." But we don't see the tears. We see the execution order. And his own death? In 1540, Henry turned on him. Cromwell had arranged the marriage to Anne of Cleves, and Henry found her ugly. That was the excuse. Cromwell was arrested without trial, condemned by a bill of attainder, and beheaded. He asked his executioner to do it quickly, for I am a man of a short neck. That's dark humor. That's a man who knew the game he was playing. He is usually portrayed as a sociopath. But the evidence suggests a deeply feeling man who wept for his wife and daughters, who wrote loving letters, and who genuinely believed that the law should apply equally to rich and poor. He was not a monster. He was a technician, and when the machine turned on him, he accepted it with dignity. The lie is that Cromwell was uniquely evil. He wasn't. He was just efficient. And efficiency, in a brutal age, looks like cruelty. Catherine of Aragon was a passive, wronged saint. We have the opposite problem with Catherine of Aragon that we have with Anne Boleyn. Anne is too sexy. Catherine is too saintly. In every movie, she is the weeping woman in the corner, praying, refusing to give in to Henry's demands, but ultimately helpless. She is the victim, the good woman crushed by the bad king. I hate this portrayal because Catherine of Aragon was one of the toughest people ever born. Let's rewind. Catherine was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the monarchs who unified Spain, expelled the Jews, and funded Columbus. She was raised in a war camp. She watched her mother ride into battle. At age 3, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales. At 15, she married him. He died 5 months later. She was left a teenage widow in a foreign country. Her father-in-law, Henry VII, refused to return her dowry. He kept her poor, isolated, and desperate for years. She lived on bread and her own embroidery. She wrote desperate letters to her father. He ignored her. For 7 years she was a pawn. Then Henry VIII became king. He married her immediately against the advice of his council. Why? Because he genuinely loved her, or at least he genuinely desired her. She was beautiful, intelligent, and royal. For the first 20 years of his reign, she was his partner. When Henry went to war in France, he made Catherine regent of England. Not a figurehead. Regent, with full power. And when the Scots invaded, Catherine, heavily pregnant, rode north, gave a rousing speech to the English army, and oversaw the defeat of the Scots at the Battle of Flodden. She sent Henry the bloodied coat of the dead Scottish king as a trophy. That is not a passive saint. That is a warrior queen. The lie of her passivity continues through the divorce. She did not just weep, she fought. She hired the best lawyers in Europe. She appealed directly to the Pope. She refused to leave the court when Henry demanded it. She famously threw herself at Henry's feet during a trial and begged him to remember the years of love. But when that failed, she did not grovel. She retired to a series of cold, damp castles and wrote letters to the Pope, to her nephew Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to anyone who would listen. She dictated a letter to Henry on her deathbed, forgiving him, but also asking him to remember his soul. She died still calling herself Queen of England. She never surrendered the title. That is not weakness. That is stubbornness so profound it looks like holiness. We also ignore her role as a mother. Her daughter, Mary, was devastated by the divorce. Catherine raised Mary alone, teaching her Latin, Spanish, and the art of politics. When Mary became queen, she tried to restore Catholicism not because she was a fanatic, but because her mother had taught her that it was the truth. Everything Mary did, she did to honor Catherine. So stop picturing Catherine as a weeping Madonna. Picture her as a general, because that's what she was. The Spanish Armada was a total catastrophe for Spain. This is the lie that English schoolchildren are taught with national pride. 1588. The mighty Spanish Armada sails to invade England. The tiny English navy, led by Francis Drake and Charles Howard, defeats them. A great storm, the Protestant wind, scatters the Shanxiade ships. England is saved. Spain is humiliated. The truth is much messier and much less heroic. First, the Armada was not defeated by English ships. The English fired thousands of cannonballs. They sank exactly 1 Spanish ship in battle. 1. The rest of the damage was done by the Spanish themselves, poor planning, rotten food, disease, and the weather. The English strategy was not to sink the Armada, but to break its formation and force it into the North Sea, where the winds would do the rest. Second, the Armada's mission was flawed from the start. The plan was for the Armada to sail to the Netherlands, pick up the Duke of Parma's army, and invade England. But Parma's army was not ready. The Dutch rebels controlled the shallow waters. There was no deep-water port to load the troops. Even if the Armada had arrived perfectly, the invasion would have failed because the army was stuck on the beach. Third, the Spanish did not see it as a catastrophe. They lost about 50 ships out of 130, a significant loss, but not a fleet-destroying one. They rebuilt within 2 years, and they launched 2 more armadas in 1596 and 1597 that were also defeated by weather and bad logistics. The war between England and Spain continued for another 16 years. It ended in a stalemate. Neither side won. But here's the lie that really stings. The Protestant wind, the storm that destroyed the Armada as it sailed around Scotland and Ireland, killed more Spaniards than the English navy did. Thousands of sailors drowned or were washed ashore in Ireland, where they were executed by English commanders. The English claimed divine intervention. God blew with his winds and they were scattered. But the same storms also destroyed English ships in other years. Weather is not divine. Weather is weather. The English celebration of the Armada victory was propaganda. Elizabeth I needed a win. The 1580s had been miserable. War in the Netherlands, poverty at home, the threat of assassination. The Armada gave her a narrative. She rode to Tilbury in symbolic armor. She was not actually wearing a metal breastplate. That's another lie, and gave a speech. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Great speech, but the actual battle was a messy, chaotic, indecisive affair. We remember it as Trafalgar. It was not. It was a draw that England spun into a triumph. And the Spanish, they printed medals that said, God sent the winds, not the English. They blamed the weather, not their own incompetence. Both sides lied. Both sides rewrote history, and we still believe the English version because Shakespeare wrote about it, and Hollywood filmed it. Tudor people had no concept of privacy or personal space. This one comes from a misunderstanding of architecture. You look at a Tudor Great Hall, a huge room where everyone ate, slept, worked, and socialized. You see no walls, no curtains, no cubicles. You conclude they had no privacy. They were like animals in a barn. Wrong. They had a different concept of privacy. Not none. Different. Let's start with the wealthy. A Tudor nobleman's house was not one room. It was a labyrinth. Behind the great hall were withdrawing rooms. Literally, rooms you withdrew to. The word privacy comes from the same root as private. They understood the need to get away from servants. The lord and lady had their own bedchamber. The bed had curtains that could be drawn. That was privacy. But you're thinking of the poor, the peasant family in a one-room cottage. No walls, 6 kids, 1 bed. That's not privacy, right? Here's the twist. The lack of physical privacy did not mean they had no private thoughts. They developed other ways of being alone. They went to the fields. They went to the forest. They went to church. They sat by the fire after everyone else fell asleep. Privacy was a behavior, not a room. What they didn't have was our modern obsession with privacy as a right. They lived in a world where survival required constant cooperation. You watched your neighbor's children. You shared your tools. You knew everyone's business. And that wasn't oppressive to them. It was normal. The idea that you should have a room that no one enters, that you should lock your bedroom door, that you should own your own space that is a modern middle-class invention. It didn't exist in Tudor England because it didn't need to. The lie is that they suffered from the lack of privacy. They didn't. They suffered from disease, from hunger, from violence, but not from sharing a bed with 3 siblings. That's us projecting our own comfort onto the past. There's a famous diary entry from a Tudor merchant. He complains that his wife will not stop talking. He says, "I have no place to hide but the privy." The toilet was his sanctuary. That's a human joke, not a historical tragedy. Tudor medicine was all leeches, bloodletting, and superstition. Okay, I'll give you this one. They did use leeches. They did believe in the four humors. They did think that disease was caused by bad air or God's punishment. But to say that Tudor medicine was worthless is to ignore the real, practical, life-saving knowledge they had. Let's start with herbs. Tudor apothecaries had an encyclopedia of plant-based remedies. Some were nonsense, but many worked. Willow bark, they used it for pain. That's aspirin. Foxglove, they used it for dropsy fluid retention. That's the source of digoxin, a heart medication still used today. Garlic for infections. Honey for wounds. Honey is antibacterial. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew it worked. Surgery was brutal, yes. No anesthesia, no antiseptics. But Tudor surgeons were skilled at amputations, setting bones, and treating arrow wounds. They had developed better techniques during the constant wars with France and Scotland. A good Tudor surgeon could remove a bladder stone in under a minute. The patient would scream, but they would survive. The real failure was in understanding germs. They didn't. So they didn't wash their hands before surgery. That killed more people than the disease. But in their defense, no one in Europe knew about germs until the 19th century. The Tudors were not uniquely stupid. They were limited by their technology. And here's a fact that will surprise you. Tudor England had public health laws. After the plague outbreaks of the 14th century, cities realized that filth caused disease. They didn't know bacteria, but they knew that cleaning streets reduced sickness. So they employed scavengers to remove garbage. They fined people for throwing waste in the river. They quarantined plague victims, locking them in their houses with a red cross on the door. That's exactly what we did with COVID, just with less science. The lie is that they were helpless. They were not. They had a system. It was flawed, but it was rational based on the information they had. And they achieved things we cannot. They survived childbirth at rates that, while terrible by modern standards, were better than in the Victorian era. Victorian doctors introduced unwashed hands from the morgue to the maternity ward. Tudor midwives washed their hands in vinegar. Guess which group had lower infection rates? Don't romanticize Tudor medicine. But don't dismiss it as witchcraft either. The Tudors were all literate or all illiterate. This is a weird binary. Depending on the movie, either every Tudor person is reading Latin poetry or they're all making marks with an X. The truth is more interesting. Let's start at the top. Henry VIII was highly literate. He wrote books. He composed music. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were among the best educated women in Europe. Elizabeth could translate Greek on the spot. That's true, but what about the middle class? In 1500, perhaps 10% of men and 1% of women could read. By 1600, those numbers had doubled. The Reformation changed everything. Protestants believed that every Christian should read the Bible. So they built schools, hundreds of them. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, London had a literacy rate of around 30% for men. That's not high by our standards, but it was rising fast. Here's the nuance. Literacy was not a binary. Many people could read, but not write. They learned to read from the Bible, or from broadsheets, the Tudor equivalent of newspapers. But writing required a different skill, taught only to clerks and merchants. So Tudor farmer might read a notice pinned to the church door, but he would sign a contract with a mark. And the poor, most could not read, but they were not stupid. They had oral culture, ballads, stories, sermons, plays. The theater was huge because it was how illiterate people got news and entertainment. Shakespeare wrote for a crowd that included illiterate groundlings. Those groundlings understood complex plots because they were trained to listen. The lie is that illiteracy equals ignorance. It does not. Many illiterate Tudor people knew more about herbal medicine, animal husbandry, and local politics than you do. They just couldn't write it down. The Tudors invented the English Reformation. This is the lie of the great man theory of history. Henry VIII wanted a divorce. He broke with Rome. Poof, the Church of England was born. The end? No, absolutely not. The English Reformation was a grassroots movement that started decades before Henry. The Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe, had been preaching against the Pope since the 14th century. They translated the Bible into English. They were burned as heretics, but their ideas survived. In the 1520s, books by Martin Luther were smuggled into England in bales of cloth. They were read in secret. Preachers like Thomas Bilney and Robert Barnes gave sermons in Cambridge taverns. Ordinary people were hungry for religious change. They were tired of paying taxes to Rome. They were tired of priests who couldn't speak English. They were tired of saints' relics that were clearly fake, like vials of the Virgin Mary's milk. There were dozens of those. When Henry broke with Rome in 1534, he did not create the Reformation. He legalized a reformation that was already happening, and then he tried to control it. He banned the very Lutherans he had once tolerated. He executed both Catholics and radical Protestants. He wanted a middle way, a Catholic church without the Pope. That was his Church of England. It had bishops, vestments, and Latin services. It was almost identical to the old church. The real Reformation, the one that made England Protestant, happened after Henry died. Under Edward VI, radical Protestants smashed the altars and banned the Latin Mass. Under Elizabeth, they created a compromise that pissed everyone off. And under the Puritans, they tried to abolish bishops entirely. Henry was a catalyst, not a cause. But we remember him as the cause because it's a better story. One king, one decision. One country changed forever. That's not how history works. History is millions of decisions made by millions of people over centuries. We have finally figured out the real Tudors. This is the meta-lie, the lie that lies beneath all the others, the belief that now, in the 21st century, with our DNA testing and our archives and our careful scholarship, we have finally uncovered the truth, that we are the first generation to see the Tudors clearly. We are not. Every generation reinvents the Tudors. In the 17th century, they were a cautionary tale about tyranny. In the 18th century, they were a Gothic horror story. In the 19th century, they were a romantic epic, thanks to Walter Scott and Victorian painters. In the 20th century, they became a soap opera. And now, in the 21st century, we are turning them into psychological case studies. We diagnose Henry with narcissistic personality disorder. We diagnose Anne with bipolar disorder. We diagnose Mary with PTSD. Those diagnoses tell us more about ourselves than about them. We are not immune to bias. We have our own lies. We believe that we are more rational than the Tudors. We are not. We believe that we are less superstitious. We are not. We just call superstition by other names: conspiracy theories, astrology, wellness influencers. We believe that we are more tolerant. We are not. We just have different targets. The real Tudors are lost. They are behind a wall of 500 years of interpretation. We can get closer to them than our ancestors could. We have better tools. But we will never have the whole truth. And the moment we think we do, we have fallen for the biggest lie of all. So, what do? We keep asking questions. We read primary sources. We doubt our own assumptions. We remember that every historical figure was a living, breathing, confused human being who didn't know how the story would end, just like us. Let me leave you with this. The Tudor era is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mirror. The lies we believe about them, that they were uniquely cruel or uniquely glamorous or uniquely stupid, are the lies we believe about ourselves. We want them to be monsters so we can feel like saints. We want them to be heroes so we can feel like heirs. But they were neither. They were people. Flawed, brilliant, terrified, hopeful people. And if you remember nothing else from this long, rambling conversation, remember this: the opposite of a lie is not the truth. The opposite of a lie is another lie that hasn't been exposed yet. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and the next time someone tells you that everyone knows something about the Tudors, ask them one question. How do you know? Chances are they don't. They just believe. If you've made it this far, you are either a true history lover or you've lost a bet. Either way, welcome. We've covered the big personalities: Anne, Henry, Mary, Elizabeth. We've covered the big events: the Armada, the Reformation, the princes in the Tower. We've punctured the myths about cleanliness, medicine, literacy, and privacy. But the Tudor lie factory has a few more floors, and the deepest lies are not about events or people. They are about ideas, about how the world worked, about what was possible. So, let's go deeper. Let's talk about the lies that shape the very way you imagine Tudor life, from the clothes on their backs to the thoughts in their heads. Tudor women had no power, and just did what their fathers and husbands told them. This is the lie of the passive woman. And it is everywhere. Even in good historical dramas, women are either victims or exceptions. The exceptional woman trope. She's the one who talks back, who rides a horse, who reads a book. Everyone else is a silent embroiderer. Let me show you the evidence that shatters this. First, the law. Tudor England had coverture, a legal doctrine that said a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or sue in court. That sounds absolute. But Tudor women found dozens of ways around it. Widows had full legal rights, and many chose not to remarry because they preferred the freedom. Single women, femmes souls, could run businesses, own land, and pay taxes. In London, about 10% of businesses were run by women. They were brewers, grocers, silk merchants, even blacksmiths. Second, the economy. Tudor England ran on women's labor. Farming was not a male-only job. Women worked the fields alongside men, reaping, binding, threshing. They managed the dairy, the poultry, the garden. They brewed ale, a huge part of the diet, and sold it in their local communities. A woman who brewed good ale could become a local celebrity. A woman who brewed bad ale was put in the stocks. That's power. The power to poison your neighbors. Third, the household. A Tudor wife was not a servant. She was the household manager. She controlled the budget, the food stores, the servants, the children's education. In merchant families, wives often ran the shop while husbands traveled. They kept the books, they made decisions, and if a husband was abusive, there were church courts. Women could sue for separation, not divorce, but a legal separation of bed and board. Thousands did. The real power, however, was informal. Tudor women had networks. They shared information, traded favors, spread gossip. Gossip was not trivial. It was intelligence. A woman who knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed whom money, who was secretly Protestant or secretly Catholic, that woman had leverage, and they used it. Look at Margaret, Thomas More's daughter. She was one of the most educated women in England. She corresponded with Erasmus. When her father was imprisoned, she smuggled letters to him. She argued with him about theology. She was not a silent, obedient daughter. She was a partner. Look at Bess of Hardwicke. She married 4 times, each time climbing higher. She became the richest non-royal woman in England. She built Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall, and she built it herself. She outmaneuvered Elizabeth I's own courtiers. She was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly unapologetic. The lie that Tudor women were powerless serves a purpose. It makes our own era look more progressive. It tells us a story of progress. We started in chains. Now we are free. But the reality is messier. Tudor women had different constraints than modern women, but they fought them, bent them, and sometimes broke them. They were not silent. We just haven't been listening. The Tudors were deeply religious, in a way we cannot understand. This is a sophisticated lie. It comes from well-meaning historians who say, "You cannot judge the Tudors by modern secular standards." They believed in God, hell, and salvation, in a literal, all-consuming way. And that's true for some, but not for all, and not all the time. Here's the truth they don't tell you. Tudor England was full of religious skeptics, people who doubted, people who thought the priests were con artists, people who went to church because the law required it, not because they believed. We have trial records. In the church courts, people were accused of saying things like, "The Bible is just a story. The soul dies with the body. There is no heaven or hell, only this life." These were not atheists in the modern sense. The word didn't exist, but they were skeptics, and there were many of them. Even the devout were not uniformly devout. Henry VIII heard 3 masses a day for most of his life. He also robbed monasteries, executed a bishop who disagreed with him, and married 6 women. That's not consistent piety. That's a man using religion as a tool. He believed, yes, but he also believed that God had made him king, and therefore whatever he did was God's will. That's not humility before the divine. That's narcissism wearing a cross. And the common people, they blended Christianity with older folk beliefs. They wore amulets against the evil eye. They recited charms that mixed Latin prayers with pagan phrases. They visited cunning folk, local healers who used magic more often than they visited priests. The church condemned this as superstition. The people did it anyway, because they wanted results, not theology. The Reformation actually increased religious anxiety. Before, you could confess your sins, do penance, and feel better. After, you had to wonder, am I one of the elect? Am I predestined for heaven or hell? That uncertainty drove some people to desperate acts, but it drove others to indifference. If God has already decided, they thought, why bother going to church? So, no, Tudor people were not uniformly religious in a way we cannot understand. They were human. They had doubts. They had hypocrisies. They had moments of genuine faith and moments of utter cynicism. Just like us. Tudor executions were always gruesome spectacles with huge crowds. This one is partly true. Executions did happen. They could be gruesome. But the Hollywood version, the massive crowd cheering as the axe falls, is a distortion. First, most executions were not public beheadings. Beheading was for the nobility. It was considered merciful, a sharp axe, a quick stroke. The common person was hanged. Sometimes they were burned at the stake for heresy. But even then, the crowds were not always huge. Many executions happened in remote locations or inside prison yards. The authorities did not always want a spectacle. Spectacles could turn into riots. Second, the crowds that did attend were not bloodthirsty monsters. They were ordinary people who had been taught that public punishment was necessary for order. They believed that watching a criminal die reinforced social norms. It was civic religion, not sadism. Many accounts describe crowds weeping, praying, even fainting. And after the execution, people rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in the blood, not out of ghoulishness, but because the blood of the executed was believed to have healing powers. That's a superstition, not cruelty. Third, the most famous execution, Anne Boleyn's, was not a public orgy of hate. She was executed inside the Tower of London, not on Tower Hill. Only about 1,000 people watched, a small crowd by London standards, and she was given a sword, not an axe. A French swordsman was brought in specifically to make it quick. The crowd was reportedly silent, shocked. Many were moved to tears. Thomas More's execution? He joked with the executioner. "See me safe up. For my coming down I can shift for myself." The crowd laughed nervously. That's not a mob. That's a community witnessing something they knew was wrong but could not stop. The lie serves a purpose. It makes us feel civilized. We don't do that anymore. But we do. We just call it lethal injection. And we hide it behind prison walls. The Tudors were more honest about their violence. We are more hypocritical. Anne of Cleves was the ugly wife that Henry rejected. Poor Anne of Cleves. She has gone down in history as the Flanders mare, a big, ugly, horse-faced German who Henry couldn't stomach. He called her no better than a horse. He said she smelled. He said she had pockmarks. He divorced her after 6 months. Let me tell you the truth that will make you furious. Anne of Cleves was not ugly. We have Holbein's portrait of her. It shows a pleasant, respectable woman. Not a great beauty, perhaps, but not ugly. Henry's problem was not her face. It was politics. Here's the context. Henry sent Holbein to paint Anne and her sister because he needed an alliance with the German Protestant princes. He was isolated in Europe. France and Spain were both hostile. The Cleves marriage was a diplomatic transaction. Henry agreed to it, sight unseen, based on Holbein's portrait. When Anne arrived in England, Henry met her in disguise, a stupid romantic gesture he had used before. He kissed her. She didn't know who he was. She was polite, but not effusive. Henry's ego was bruised. He stormed off and said, "I like her not." But here's the real reason he rejected her. By the time Anne arrived, the diplomatic situation had changed. The German princes had made peace with France, so the alliance was no longer needed. Henry wanted out, and Anne was a convenient excuse. He blamed her appearance because it was easier than admitting he had made a political miscalculation. The divorce was remarkably gentle by Henry's standards. He gave Anne a generous settlement. Hever Castle, the Boleyn family home, ironically a large income, and the title, the king's beloved sister. She outlived all his other wives. She became friends with Mary and Elizabeth. She was invited to court. She died wealthy and respected. The ugly story was spread by Henry's ambassadors, who needed to justify the king's decision. It was a lie then. It's a lie now. Anne of Cleves was not a beauty, but she was not a monster. And she got the last laugh. She lived, while Henry died in pain and obesity. Sir Thomas More was a pure, principled martyr. This is the other side of the Cromwell coin. If Cromwell is the villain, Thomas More is the saint. A man of conscience who refused to betray his faith, even at the cost of his head. He was canonized by the Catholic Church. He is held up as a model of moral courage. I admire Thomas More. His Utopia is a brilliant work. His wit, even on the scaffold, was astonishing. But the saintly image is a lie. More was not a gentle, tolerant man. He was a persecutor. As Lord Chancellor, More actively hunted Protestants. He interrogated heretics in his own home. He approved of burning them. He wrote pamphlets calling Luther a wretched, venomous beast. He believed that heretics should be punished severely. One man, John Tewkesbury, was burned alive because More personally questioned him and found him guilty. More watched. He did not flinch. Now, you can argue that this was the 16th century. Everyone persecuted everyone. The Protestants would later burn Catholics. That's true. But the myth of More as a pure, saintly figure erases this part of his life. We remember the man who said, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." We forget the man who said, "If heretics will not amend their errors, let them be burned." More was complex. He was a loving father. His letters to his children are tender and playful. He was a brilliant lawyer. He was funny. He refused to endorse Henry's divorce even though it cost him everything. That takes courage. But he was also a fanatic. His faith was not a gentle meadow. It was a sword. The lie that More was a pure martyr serves the Catholic Church's narrative. The lie that he was a heartless bigot serves the Protestant narrative. The truth is that he was both. And we have to hold both truths in our heads at the same time. That's hard. That's why we prefer the cartoon. The Tudor Golden Age was a time of peace and prosperity. This is the lie that Elizabethan propaganda sold, and that we still buy. The defeat of the Armada, the flourishing of Shakespeare, the voyages of Drake and Raleigh, the myth of Merry England, a land of maypoles, roast beef, and contented peasants. Let's look at the economic reality. The Tudor period, especially the second half, was marked by catastrophic inflation. Prices rose 400% over the 16th century. Wages did not keep up. Real wages for laborers fell by more than half. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. Enclosure, the fencing off of common land for sheep farming, threw thousands of peasants off the land. They became vagrants. Vagrancy laws were brutally enforced. Whipping, branding, hanging for repeat offenders. The poor were criminalized for being poor. The 1590s saw a series of harvest failures. Famine swept England. People ate dogs, cats, even rats. In some villages, the death rate doubled. Elizabeth's government did little to help. The Poor Laws were a start. They created a system of parish relief, but they were inadequate. Thousands died. And peace? England was at war for most of Elizabeth's reign, first with France, then with Spain, then with Ireland. The Irish wars were genocidal. English commanders boasted of killing women and children. The Golden Age for England was a bloody nightmare for Ireland. Shakespeare wrote his plays in a London that was overcrowded, what happened then, and full of desperate immigrants fleeing the countryside. The theaters were shut down during outbreaks. His audience included pickpockets, prostitutes, and traumatized veterans. So, why do we call it a Golden Age? Because Elizabeth's propagandists invented the term. They wanted to contrast her reign with the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and the cruelty of her father and sister. They wanted to create a myth of stability and glory, and it worked. We still believe it. But the real Elizabethan age was not golden, it was gilded. A thin layer of gold paint over a rotten structure. Tudor children were treated as miniature adults. This comes from a famous book by Philippe Arias, Centuries of Childhood, which argued that in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, there was no concept of childhood. Children worked, dressed like adults, and were treated harshly. That book has been largely debunked, but the idea persists. Tudor people absolutely recognized childhood as a distinct phase. They had toys, dolls, spinning tops, hobby horses, even board games. They had children's songs, nursery rhymes, and stories. They had special clothes for children, not miniature adult clothes, but simpler, looser garments. Yes, children worked. On a farm, children helped from the age of 5 or 6. But so did children in 19th century America. Work was not seen as a violation of childhood. It was seen as preparation for adulthood, and they still played. Archaeologists have found countless small toys in Tudor sites. Discipline was harsh by our standards. Children were beaten. But so were servants, apprentices, and even soldiers. Physical punishment was normal for everyone, not just kids. And Tudor parents also showed affection. We have letters from parents mourning dead children with raw, heartbreaking grief. They loved their children. They just expressed it differently. The miniature adult lie serves the narrative of progress. We invented childhood, they didn't. But childhood is not an invention. It's a biological reality. What changes is the social construction of childhood, what children are allowed to do, what they wear, how they are educated. In that sense, Tudor childhood was different, but it was still childhood. The Tudors had no sense of humor. Everything was solemn and religious. I saved this one for near the end because it's so obviously false. Yet people believe it. Look at the portraits. Everyone is frowning. Look at the religious art. Everyone is suffering. Conclusion: Tudors were grim. Let me introduce you to Tudor humor. First, fart jokes. Seriously, Shakespeare's full of them. The plays are filled with bawdy puns, slapstick, and grotesque comedy. The groundlings loved a good fart joke. So did the nobility. Second, satire. Utopia by Thomas More is a satire. It's not a blueprint for a perfect society, it's a joke. The name Utopia means no place. More was making fun of idealists. He was also making fun of England. The book is hilarious if you know the context. Third, practical jokes. The Tudor court was full of them. Henry VIII had a fool, Will Somers, who mocked the king to his face. Somers once said to Henry, "God save your majesty, but you have the most ungrateful children of any man in England." That's a joke about Henry's heirs. Henry laughed. Usually. Fourth, wordplay. The Tudors loved puns. They loved double entendres. Anne Boleyn's motto was "the most happy." After she was arrested, someone crossed out "most" and wrote "never." That's dark humor. That's Tudor gallows humor. The lie that Tudors had no humor is actually a modern projection. We look at their serious religious art and forget that they also had comic ballads, funny woodcuts, and rowdy festivals. They laughed. They laughed at sex, at death, at the king, at themselves. They were not robots. The Tudors are dead and gone, and their lies no longer matter. This is the lie that allows us to treat history as entertainment. The Tudors are not just dead people in ruffs. They are the architects of our modern world. And their lies, the ones they told about themselves and their enemies, are still operating in our politics, our media, and our minds. When a politician calls his opponent a monster, that's the Henry VIII lie. When a female leader is called cold or hysterical, that's the Anne Boleyn lie. When a religious minority is demonized with exaggerated numbers of atrocities, that's the Bloody Mary lie. When a nation tells itself it has a golden age while ignoring its violence, that's the Elizabeth lie. The Tudors invented modern propaganda. They used printing presses, portraits, and public spectacles to control how they were remembered. And they succeeded. We are still reading their press releases. So the final act of resistance is not to stop watching Tudor dramas. It's to watch them with a skeptical eye, to ask, who benefits from this story? To remember that every portrait was a lie, every speech was a spin, every history book was written by a winner. The Tudors were not unique. Their lies are not unique. Human beings have always lied about power, about love, about religion. The only difference is that we have the tools DNA, archives, archaeology to catch them in their lies. And we still choose to believe the prettier version. Why? Because the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that Henry VIII was not a monster, but a man, and men can do monstrous things while still being human. The truth is that Anne Boleyn was not a witch or a saint, just a brilliant woman who played a deadly game and lost. The truth is that Bloody Mary was not a demon, just a traumatized queen trying to save a world that no longer existed. The truth is that we are the Tudors. We have the same capacity for self-deception, for cruelty, for love, for courage, and the lies we tell about them are the lies we tell about ourselves. So where do we go from here? I'm not going to tell you to stop enjoying history. I love it too much for that. But I am going to ask you to do one thing. The next time you hear a fact about the past, especially a fact that feels satisfying, that confirms what you already believe, that makes you feel smart or righteous, stop. Ask yourself, who first said this? Why did they say it? Who benefited? And what evidence exists outside of that source? That's not just good history, that's good citizenship. Because the lies of the past are the lies of the present, just wearing different clothes. The Tudors are not a puzzle to be solved. They are a warning. They are a mirror. And if you look closely enough, you'll see your own face. Thank you for listening. Now, go read a primary source. Question everything, and never trust a portrait.